Eileen, calm down and listen. My sister just collapsed.
Over the phone, my husband Nate breathlessly told me this. But Karen, my sister-in-law, was right next to me, happily enjoying a shopping trip. I instinctively asked him to confirm if it was really Karen who had collapsed. Nate responded with a tone of exasperation.
Of course, that's what I'm saying. Anyway, I'll be staying at my parents' place for a while to take care of her until she's discharged from the hospital.
Without waiting for my response, he hurriedly hung up. Nate and I have been married for 2 years. When we first got married, we were on good terms, and both work and home life were going well. However, a year into our marriage, when we couldn't conceive, we started infertility treatments. Around that time, Nate began acting distant. One day, I heard rumors from his colleague that Nate was unusually close to a newly hired female employee. Just to be sure, I hired a private investigator to look into it, and it turned out that Nate was indeed having an affair. Apparently, on the days he claimed to be working late, he was visiting his mistress's house, and on weekends when he went out without telling me, he was going on dates with her. This time, him lying about Karen collapsing was probably just an excuse to go on a trip with his mistress. When I told Karen about Nate's affair, she quickly grasped the situation and burst out laughing. She explained that she had some free time and decided to visit us, but couldn't get through to Nate. So she reached out to me, and we ended up going shopping together on short notice. Nate would never imagine that Karen and I were together. Karen exchanged a mischievous glance with me and said,
"This is the perfect chance to teach him a lesson, don't you think?"
"My name is Eileen Hoppers, 34 years old. At 28, I was hired mid-career as the secretary to the president of a large international food manufacturer. My husband Nate, who I've been married to for 2 years, works as a sales representative for a major insurance company. He's 2 years older than me, and his calm demeanor mixed with a good sense of humor was one of his most attractive traits. I first met Nate when he visited my company to propose insurance products tailored for businesses. The product proposals for corporations, requiring coverage for a wider range of risks than individual policies, were complex, but Nate thoroughly understood our needs and explained everything clearly and straightforwardly. I was drawn to his professional demeanor, though his tall stature and striking looks made him seem a bit unapproachable. To my surprise, Nate was the one who initiated contact. After having one in-depth conversation, I realized he was not only humorous, but also genuinely sincere. After exchanging contact information that day, Nate started messaging me often. Most of his messages were about his dog or his favorite new drink, just lighthearted chatter. As I replied to his messages, I found myself falling for the gap between his professional side and his personal side. 2 weeks after exchanging contact info, Nate asked me out on a date. Since entering the workforce, I'd been so focused on my job that I hadn't gone on a date since my school days. It felt almost unreal, but I cautiously said yes. During our date, I learned that Nate's family was based in the United Kingdom. Interestingly, the headquarters of the food company I work for is also in the UK, and his paternal grandfather used to be its president. His grandfather moved to the UK for work and married a British employee. The family was born and raised in the UK up until Nate's generation. Although both of Nate's parents are British, his demeanor and confidence seemed influenced by his exposure to American culture. In high school, he considered staying in the UK for college and work, but also dreamed of living in the US, where his roots were. He ended up pursuing both college and a career in the US, which speaks to his determination. Despite our opposite personalities, his boldness and my caution, we clicked and got married a year after meeting. Before the wedding, I visited his family in the UK. It was my first trip abroad. which made me even more nervous. However, both my in-laws and my sister-in-law were very friendly and approachable, and I quickly felt at ease. Karen and I especially hit it off over our shared taste in music, exchanging thoughts on our favorite artist's latest songs. We even swapped contact info on messaging apps and have kept in touch regularly since then. We held our wedding in the US, inviting colleagues and friends. Nate's family couldn't attend due to work commitments, but sent us a heartfelt video message instead. Both of my parents are already retired, so they were able to attend our wedding. Additionally, we can meet frequently as long as our schedules align. In contrast, Nate's family is always busy. Karen is a sought-after freelance designer, and both of Nate's parents are public servants. Since they have packed schedules, we haven't seen them since our pre-wedding visit. On the other hand, married life with Nate started smoothly. He willingly proposed sharing household chores, which allowed us to balance work and home life. On weekends, he often took me on drives, which was a refreshing change for me. About a year after our wedding, we started trying for a baby. Even before getting married, we had talked about wanting children. However, a year passed without success, and I started feeling increasingly anxious. Since we are both over 30, having a child later in life poses higher risks. Considering the burden on both of us, it seemed best to start trying for a baby as soon as possible. When I brought this up to Nate, he seemed a bit reluctant but eventually agreed. After consulting a doctor, we decided to first aim for natural conception through treatment, and if that didn't work, to move on to IVF. The treatment involved medication, but I also focused on things I could do, like regular exercise and improving my diet, and Nate and I worked on this together. At first, Nate participated willingly, but about 2 years into our marriage, he started avoiding me whenever the topic of trying for a baby came up. Although I took the lead in our efforts, I never forced him into anything. I couldn't think of any reason why he started avoiding me, and at first I was just confused. If our relationship got worse, not only would our infertility remain unresolved, but it might even lead to divorce. Fearing that, I decided to consult with our doctor and temporarily pause our efforts. However, Nate's distant attitude didn't change. In fact, it worsened. Where we used to spend weekends together, he now started leaving the house quietly in the morning without saying anything. When he returned, he brushed off my questions about what he'd done that day with an annoyed attitude. One day, while shopping after work, I unexpectedly ran into someone I knew. It was one of Nate's colleagues, a woman from his sales department who had joined the company at the same time as him. I had only met her at our wedding, but I remembered thinking she seemed like a nice person. To my surprise, she said she had something she wanted to tell me. She prefaced her shocking statement by asking me not to take it too seriously.
Your husband, seems unusually close to a new hire who joined this spring.
According to her, the new hire was a young woman in the accounting department who frequently visited Nate's sales department. She often claimed to have questions about receipts, but apparently only ever approached Nate. Not only that, but they were often seen going out together during lunch breaks.
Since he started getting close to that girl, he stopped talking about how much he loves his wife. That's what made me concerned.
She said she decided to tell me because she was worried about me. I thanked her, though inside I felt deeply unsettled. When I connected Nate's recent distant behavior with what I just heard, it all started to make sense. The thought of him actually having an affair terrified me, but ignoring my growing suspicions was just as unbearable. So I decided to bring it up indirectly. Over dinner, I casually mentioned that he hadn't been talking about work much lately. Since you're in a mentoring role now, how's it going with the younger employees at your office? At that, Nate noticeably flinched and glared at me.
Don't bring up work at home. It ruins my appetite.
He used to talk about his recent projects and colleagues without me even asking. Now, it seemed like he was avoiding the topic because he had something to hide. Instead of easing my worries, this only made them worse. A few days later, I had to visit Nate's company as a secretary to discuss something with their CEO. After our wedding, Nate had been replaced as the account manager for my company. As I walked through the building, I couldn't help but think about the rumors his colleague had told me. But I reminded myself that I was here for work and tried to push the thoughts aside. As I was being escorted to the meeting room, we passed by what looked like a break room. I heard voices from inside, and one of them was Nate's. Curious, I returned after reaching the meeting room and peeked through the small window on the door. Inside, I saw Nate sitting closely with a young female employee on the sofa. He had his arm around her shoulder, and they were chatting so closely their faces were nearly touching. This was clearly beyond what would be considered appropriate between a supervisor and a junior employee. Even though I had mentally prepared myself after hearing the rumors, seeing it with my own eyes was gut-wrenching. For 2 years of marriage, Nate and I had supported each other both in work and in life. Our opposite personalities, his boldness and my sensitivity, had made us a complementary couple, fostering mutual respect. What had gone wrong? I had suggested we start trying for a baby, but it wasn't as if I had forced him. Things didn't start getting this strained until later. Then, I suddenly remembered what his colleague had said. Since he started getting close to that girl, he stopped talking about how much he loves his wife. It became increasingly clear that his affair was likely the reason for our marital troubles. Suppressing my urge to turn away from reality, I took out my smartphone. Through the lens, I captured the two of them, unaware of my presence, acting intimately. I steadied my trembling hands and took photos as evidence before quietly leaving the area. On the train ride back to my office, I stared at the pictures I had just taken. To me, this was undeniable proof of an affair, but I worried it might not be taken seriously since it was captured by me, his wife. Additionally, I realized that to make a case for infidelity, I would need to understand not just their workplace interactions, but also their behavior outside of work. Looking back, I realized I still couldn't accept the reality that Nate was having an affair and desperately wanted to deny it somehow. A few days later, I consulted a private investigator and requested an investigation into the personal information of the young female employee and her actions with Nate. Within about a week, they had gathered sufficient evidence. The woman's name was Megan Carter, 23 years old. She was a new hire in the accounting department, having joined the company this spring. It was clear she was the young employee Nate's colleague had mentioned. The investigation into their actions also provided more than enough evidence of the affair. On every occasion, Nate claimed to be working late. He was heading to Megan's apartment with her. Likewise, every time he left the house quietly on weekends, he seemed to be enjoying dates with her. Most of the evidence was provided in photos, though some were videos. I played one of the videos that captured their conversation at a restaurant. They were smiling at each other like a merry couple, feeding each other bites of their meals. Just watching this scene was painful enough for me to want to stop, but their conversation was even more shocking. As Megan ate happily, Nate gazed at her with a softened expression and murmured,
You're so much better than my old hag of a wife. You're young, fresh, and adorable.
Megan blushed and grabbed Nate's arm.
That's sweet, but I feel bad for your wife, you know?
Though she said she felt bad, her smile was mischievous. In other words, Megan knew Nate was married yet continued the relationship. For a moment, I had worried that she might have been an innocent party, unknowingly involved with a married man. But that small sense of pity vanished entirely. After this investigation, I decided to demand a divorce from Nate. However, by this time, Nate was hardly ever home, making it difficult to bring up the topic. A few days later, while shopping for groceries, I received a call. It was rare for me to get calls that weren't work-related. Wondering who it might be, I glanced at my phone screen and saw it was Karen. She explained that her work had settled down, and she had finally found time to return to the US. She had first tried calling Nate, but got no response, so she called me instead. As it happened, I had taken the day off because I was leaving for a business trip to the UK the next morning. Considering the time difference, I had to catch a flight at 5 a.m. UK time. To prepare, I planned to stay at a hotel near the airport that evening and take an early bus directly to the terminal. Incidentally, I had already told Nate about this trip directly. But since he had been so distracted and non-committal in his responses lately, I had started relying on text for important updates. Even then, he often left my messages unread. It was likely that he wasn't even aware of my upcoming trip. I hadn't told his family about the trip either. They were kind and supportive, but I worried they might go out of their way to help, which I didn't want to burden them with. Given all this, when Karen invited me out, I hesitated over how to respond. After some thought, I agreed to meet her until noon since I had errands to run. When we reunited after several years, Karen was as lively as ever, and her energy was contagious. Though she playfully complained, she seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with me. We visited a recently opened large shopping mall, bought albums from our favorite artists, and picked out clothes for each other, enjoying every moment. Yet, the thought of Nate spending time happily with Megan crept into my mind, filling me with sadness and frustration. Karen must have noticed because she expressed concern.
Eileen, you've been looking a little pale. Are you okay? Should we take a break?
As I struggled to respond, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw it was Nate. Even though he had left without a word today and hadn't responded to Karen's call, he was suddenly contacting me. When Karen saw it was Nate, she said she would listen in and leaned closer to hear his voice. Nate sounded unusually out of breath and flustered.
Eileen, calm down and listen. My sister just collapsed.
Karen and I exchanged incredulous looks. What? It's my sister-in-law who collapsed, right? When I asked that, he impatiently started talking over me.
Yes, that's what I said. Anyway, I'll be staying at my parents' house for a while to take care of her.
According to him, Karen had a severe chronic illness, and this time her condition had worsened to the point of requiring hospitalization. Their parents were busy with work, so Nate, having more flexibility, would look after her.
Don't worry about it, but don't contact my parents. They're swamped. And don't contact Karen either, okay? Understand?
After issuing this forceful warning, Nate abruptly hung up. Karen, who had been listening the whole time, sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what she had just heard. I realized I couldn't keep this from her any longer, so I told Karen the truth about Nate's affair. After hearing me out, Karen quickly understood the situation. In other words, Nate had likely lied about his sister collapsing to create an excuse to spend time with his mistress. Incidentally, Karen doesn't have any chronic illnesses and rarely even catches a cold.
Nate hurt you by cheating, and now he's using me as an excuse? That's just disgusting.
Karen's usual cheerful smile disappeared, replaced by a furious expression. At the same time, I was disappointed in another realization. Nate truly hadn't remembered my upcoming business trip to the UK. When he went on work trips, even within the state, I always helped him prepare and even saw him off. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. and it must have shown on my face because Karen gave me a worried look. Then, in a kind voice, she made a suggestion.
I was planning to fly back home the day after tomorrow, but maybe I could stay a little longer with you?
Her thoughtful gesture nearly brought me to tears. Feeling I couldn't keep anything from her anymore, I told her about my UK trip. Karen looked a little surprised, but then smiled mischievously.
Well, how about we head back together and give him a little trouble while we're at it?
I agreed, and we decided to travel together. After finishing our shopping, we stayed at our respective hotels and boarded the same flight to the UK the next morning. Coincidentally, the branch office I was visiting for work was only a short drive from Karen's parents' home, so I often stopped by during breaks. Karen immediately told her parents about Nate's affair as soon as she saw them, and they were furious with Nate and apologized to me. Karen's father was especially enraged and even tried to call Nate to scold him, but Karen and I stopped him. We wanted to see how Nate would act next. We had dinner at their house almost every night, and I spent my days off entirely with them. Compared to the life where Nate ignored me, this was far happier. I even wished my UK trip could last longer. About 2 weeks after I started my stay, Nate called me. He described Karen's condition in such vivid detail it was almost convincing, painting himself as a tragic hero.
So she was discharged, but I think I'll stay here a bit longer to take care of her. Maybe another 2 weeks.
I gave him a vague reply, just as he usually did to me, and handed the phone to Karen. She seemed to be enjoying the situation, smiling mischievously as she spoke.
And who exactly is this gravely ill sister? I'm perfectly fine.
Karen then informed him that both she and her parents knew about his affair and pressed him on where he was and what he was doing. Caught off guard by Karen answering the phone, Nate was so shocked he couldn't speak. He quickly recovered and turned the tables, getting angry instead.
Why are you with my sister? You went to my parents' house without telling me. You're a terrible wife.
Lately, Nate only referred to me as his wife when blaming me for something. As I had already mentioned, I told him about my UK trip, both verbally and in writing. The fact that he was distracted by Megan and didn't listen was entirely his fault. I took the phone from Karen. I told him to check his text messages first and then unleashed all the anger I had been holding back. You're the one who's a terrible husband. Cheating and lying about Karen collapsing? How could you stoop so low? When I mentioned the word affair, Nate let out a pained cry as if deeply wronged.
An affair? Just because you're mad at me doesn't mean you can make baseless accusations. That's just awful.
Hearing this, Karen and I exchanged looks and burst out laughing. I then sent Nate all the evidence the investigator had gathered, including photos and videos. Following my instructions, Nate hesitantly opened the email and went pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. The investigator had also uncovered Megan's Instagram account. Starting the day after Nate claimed Karen had collapsed, Megan had been posting about her trip to the UK. I read one of her posts aloud in a mockingly sweet tone. On my first overseas trip with my boyfriend. If our casual trip is to the UK, where should we go for our honeymoon? I read it aloud in an overly exaggerated, cutesy tone, which made Karen burst into laughter beside me. Meanwhile, Nate, trying to hide his inner panic, was desperately searching for an excuse.
Just because she says boyfriend doesn't mean she's talking about me. This is all a misunderstanding.
But it was too late to play dumb. Karen pointed out another piece of evidence. The post I had just read included a selfie of Megan relaxing in a suite at a hotel. She had the curtains wide open, enjoying the night view. Since it was dark outside, The brightly lit interior was clearly reflected in the window, showing Nate lying on the double bed.
Next time you see Megan, remind her to be careful about taking pictures near reflective surfaces.
Other posts showed more hints, like clothes in the closet matching Nate's wardrobe and custom-made shoes by the door that looked just like his. At this point, Nate couldn't deny the accusations and finally admitted to the affair, though he tried to retaliate.
She's the one who came on to me. If a girl in her 20s shows interest, of course she's going to seem more appealing than a wife in her 30s.
Now, he was trying to justify his affair. But no matter the excuse, it didn't change the fact that he had cheated. I was too dumbfounded to respond, but Karen got angry in my place.
What do you mean, of course? By that logic, Eileen could get herself a younger boyfriend, and you wouldn't have the right to complain, right?
Hearing that, Nate whined like a child, saying he wouldn't like that at all. If he could think about my feelings that way, he wouldn't have cheated in the first place. Finally, Karen ended the call by demanding that Nate and Megan come to their parents' house together in a week when everyone was available. On the promised day, Megan arrived with an air of confidence, wearing a strong perfume. Nate, on the other hand, was tense, clearly trying to come up with a convincing excuse.
This isn't an affair. Megan was just with me on a business trip, and the hotel made a mistake, so we had to share a room.
What happened to his earlier statement that it was understandable to cheat? But anticipating such excuses, I had already looked into his schedule beforehand. I've already checked with your company. Both you and Megan are on long-term leave, aren't you? Nate started complaining about invasion of privacy, making no sense. Megan, meanwhile, looked disappointed, staring at Nate as he broke into a nervous sweat.
Come on, there's no way this was for work. We're getting married, aren't we?
Just like her Instagram posts about a honeymoon, Megan seemed to be seriously dating Nate with marriage in mind. She must have thought she was here to be introduced as his second wife. But as Nate continued to insist they were just co-workers, Megan began to panic.
Wait, the evidence you gathered must have something showing Nate promising to marry me, right?
The fact that she wanted to use the evidence of their affair as proof of his love for her showed just how audacious she was. Her hopes were quickly dashed when Nate brushed it off, claiming he must have been drunk when he said that. At last, Megan snapped.
This is so annoying. Why don't you just get divorced already? Even if you have to pay alimony, you can afford it, right?
Nate, who had been hanging his head, flinched at her words. I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for Megan, so I revealed the truth about Nate's situation. The reality was that Nate wasn't competent at work, despite his confident demeanor. His sales performance was poor, and since his company was merit-based, his salary was very low. To impress Megan on dates, he had likely been splurging on expensive items he couldn't afford. In fact, Megan admitted that Nate had paid for all the expenses for their trip to the UK. Since I managed our household finances, I could easily pull up his payroll records. When I threatened to do so, Nate quickly admitted to lying. In truth, I was the one financially supporting our household because Nate's income was so low. After exposing everything, Nate sighed deeply and gave up.
Fine, let's get divorced. But make sure we split the assets evenly, okay?
Unlike Nate, who had almost no savings, I had been diligently saving. However, I had spent a considerable amount recently on fertility treatments, so there wasn't much to divide. When I explained this, Nate blamed me as if it were my fault.
We spent all that money because of your infertility. That means the treatment costs should count towards splitting our assets too.
I let out a deep sigh at his comment. What on earth is he talking about? What are you talking about? You're the one who's infertile. The truth was, the fertility treatments were for Nate's condition. After a year of trying without success, I had dragged a reluctant Nate to the hospital for tests. The results showed that his hormonal imbalance had significantly reduced his sperm production. The doctor recommended we first aim for natural conception while working on long-term lifestyle changes, regular hormone injections, and check UPAs. If that didn't work, considering our age, the doctor suggested IVF as the next step. Though Nate claimed he wanted children, he refused to fully accept his infertility and barely listened to the doctor's explanations. For about 6 months, thanks to my efforts, the treatment was progressing smoothly. But around the time he met Megan, our relationship soured and the treatment stopped. When I explained all this, Nate turned pale. Megan, sitting next to him, also looked visibly shaken and turned away to avoid his gaze.
So, does that mean Megan's pregnancy?
Before he could finish, Megan confessed as if she had resigned herself.
I'm sorry. I lied about being pregnant. I thought if I said that, you'd marry me right away.
Apparently, Megan had told Nate she was pregnant shortly after arriving in the UK. Nate had believed her and was seriously agonizing over his relationship with her. When the tension broke, he looked slightly relieved. He turned to Megan and laughed mockingly.
Why would I get married? It's expensive, and I'm happy just living together, don't you think?
Megan suddenly dropped her earlier demure attitude and revealed her true colors.
A broke, infertile old man? I don't need you. You should be grateful I even bothered to play with you.
With that, the two of them erupted into a heated argument. Listening to their exchange, it became clear that Megan had only been interested in Nate for his money from the start. Her strong need for validation led her to indulge in showcasing a luxurious lifestyle on Instagram and other platforms. To her, Nate was nothing more than a tool to achieve that. She screamed about how she had planned an extravagant wedding to show off to everyone. Nate seemed genuinely hurt by her confession. In the end, the two began threatening to sue each other for damages, completely forgetting we were even in the room, as their fight escalated further. Nate's parents, who had been listening nearby in case they were needed, finally stepped in. His mother was in tears, and his father looked utterly exasperated. Nate's father informed me that I would be compensated for damages through a lawyer and then forcibly made Nate sign the divorce papers. Even at this point, Nate muttered complaints under his breath.
If I had money, I'd have divorced Eileen ages ago and married someone cuter than her or Megan.
Hearing this, both his parents and Karen were so appalled that they declared they were cutting ties with him. Megan, on the other hand, wanted to separate from Nate as soon as possible, but insisted he pay for her travel expenses before parting ways, a selfish demand that showed her true nature. To me, they were both lacking empathy and seemed like a perfect match. After we kicked them out, I shared this observation with Karen and Nate's parents, and we all burst into laughter. Afterward, Nate ended up burdened with a significant debt to cover the damages he owed me. The disparity in our salaries meant that most of the marital assets had come from me. Even after the compensation, it barely covered what I had spent during our marriage, especially on fertility treatments. Since Nate's salary had been low, I had always managed the household finances. It was thanks to my careful budgeting that he could spend money as he pleased and still pay taxes on time. After the divorce, Nate would no longer be able to afford his lavish lifestyle or maintain his image with younger colleagues. Meanwhile, Megan had to borrow money from her parents to pay her share of the damages. Initially, she refused to pay, claiming she was a victim and had been deceived by Nate. She even tried to sue him for damages, falsely claiming she didn't know he was married until after they started dating. It was clear that she no longer had any affection for Nate and was merely trying to extract as much money from him as possible before they parted ways. However, her attempts fell apart when her lawyer couldn't provide sufficient evidence, forcing her to drop the claim. Resigned, Megan confessed to her parents that she had knowingly engaged in an affair. Her parents, deeply ashamed, borrowed a large sum to pay the damages and insisted on apologizing to me directly. They traveled to the US to meet me and were much more remorseful and polite than Megan ever was. During our conversation, they revealed that Megan had introduced Nate to them without mentioning he was married. She had even suggested they meet him in person, but Nate had refused, citing a lack of time. In reality, Nate had no intention of marrying her and was likely afraid her parents would uncover the affair.
We genuinely believed Megan and Nate were getting married. We had no idea he was already married.
It was heartbreaking to see such kind parents left so disappointed. I sincerely hoped that Megan would repay her debts and focus on making amends to her parents. Since my company and Nate's company have a business relationship, there is frequent interaction between the two. Additionally, we invited many colleagues from both workplaces to our wedding, so we share many mutual acquaintances. Stories of his affair naturally spread among our mutual connections, tarnishing his reputation. When I checked Megan's Instagram after some time, all her posts about Nate were deleted. However, once something is on the internet, it never truly disappears. The fact of Nate's infidelity and the emotional scars he left on me would remain. Nate's preoccupation with Megan had caused his sales performance to plummet, and even his juniors mocked him. As a result, he was reassigned to a dead-end department with a salary reduced to half of what it had been, leaving him struggling in poverty. Meanwhile, my efforts at the UK branch were recognized, and I was offered a permanent position there. Although I wouldn't see Nate directly anymore, updates from his colleagues were more than enough for me. I focused on moving forward and embraced my new life in the UK. Since my long-term stay was confirmed, I splurged on a luxury apartment. Without the need to manage Nate's finances or deal with his expenses, my life became much simpler. I worked hard during the week and spent weekends enjoying barbecues in Karen's family's backyard or attending music festivals with her. There were plenty of attractive people at my new workplace, but for now, I wanted to enjoy being single. If I were to remarry, I resolved to choose someone who, regardless of income, would be honest and truly cherish me.